It was a warm afternoon in downtown Atlanta. The sun hung lazily in the sky, painting the streets with golden light. Traffic was slow and most people were finishing their workday, heading home or stopping for coffee. Two local police officers, Officer Daniels and Officer Carter, were patrolling the area in their cruiser, chatting casually about weekend plans. Everything felt calm. Just another ordinary day. As they turned a corner onto Peachtree Street, Officer Carter noticed something that caught his attention. A black SUV was parked slightly crooked near a red-painted curb, its hazard lights blinking. "Looks like someone decided to take a break in a no-parking zone," Carter muttered, half smiling. Daniels nodded. "Let's check it out. Probably someone on their phone or waiting for a friend." They pulled up behind the SUV, lights flashing briefly, not to make a scene, but just to signal a stop. Both officers stepped out of their car, straightening their uniforms, their radios crackling softly in the background. Inside the SUV sat Marcus Reed, a tall, well-built man in his late 30s. He wore a simple dark shirt, jeans, and sunglasses. He wasn't doing anything suspicious, just sitting quietly scrolling through messages on his phone. He had just finished a long morning working on a confidential FBI operation and had stopped to reply to a few emails before heading home. Marcus noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. With a sigh, he placed his phone on the passenger seat. He knew the rules: stay calm, stay respectful. He had dealt with enough police encounters in his line of work to know how quickly things could go wrong, especially when misunderstandings were involved. Officer Daniels approached the driver's side. While Carter stood slightly behind him observing, Daniels tapped on the window. "Good afternoon, sir. Can you roll down your window, please?" Marcus lowered it halfway, greeting them politely. "Afternoon, officers. Everything okay?" "License and registration, please," Daniels said, his tone firm but not unfriendly. "You're parked in a restricted zone." Marcus nodded. "Oh, I didn't notice that. My apologies. I'll move in a second." He reached slowly toward the glove compartment, speaking as he moved. "My registration's right here." But Carter's eyes narrowed. His hand instinctively rested on his holster. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them." Marcus froze, glancing up. He could see the tension in Carter's stance, that edge of suspicion that had no reason to be there. "Officer," Marcus said calmly, "I'm just getting my registration." "It's in the glove box." Daniels gave a small nod. "Go ahead." Marcus handed over his driver's license and registration card. Daniels looked at the documents, frowning slightly at the out-of-state address. "You're not from around here?" "I'm based in D.C., Marcus replied. "Just down here for work." Carter stepped closer now, peering into the SUV. "What kind of work?" Marcus hesitated for a moment. His badge was in his jacket pocket, not something he liked flashing unless necessary. "Government work," he said simply. That answer didn't sit well with Carter. "Government work?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Mind being a little more specific?" Marcus gave a polite smile. "I'm with federal law enforcement." Now Daniels looked up from the paperwork. "FBI?" he asked, half doubting, half curious. Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." There was a brief silence. Cars passed slowly by, their tires hissing on the warm asphalt. A few pedestrians on the sidewalk began to glance over, wondering why two officers were standing by a black SUV with such serious faces. Carter crossed his arms. "You got any proof of that?" "Yes," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "My badge is in my jacket pocket, left side. I can reach for it if you want." Daniels hesitated. He'd done dozens of traffic stops, but something about this one felt off. Not because Marcus seemed dangerous, but because everything was so calm, almost too calm. Carter, on the other hand, wasn't convinced. "Let's keep things clear," he said sharply.
"Step out of the vehicle, sir." Marcus took a slow breath.
He didn't argue. He unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out carefully, keeping his hands visible. He'd been in far more dangerous situations before, but something about being treated like a suspect in an ordinary parking stop always felt heavier. "Face the vehicle." "Please," Carter instructed. Daniels looked uneasy now. "Carter, maybe let's just—" But before he could finish, a man across the street started recording the encounter on his phone. The tension was obvious now, hanging in the air like static. Marcus turned his head slightly, speaking quietly but clearly. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but I assure you there's been a misunderstanding." His voice was calm, professional, the tone of someone used to authority, but respectful of it too. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "All right, let's see the badge," he said finally. Marcus nodded. "It's in my left jacket pocket." He reached slowly, carefully, and pulled it out. The unmistakable gold FBI badge, shining in the sunlight. He held it up for them to see. Daniels blinked. Carter's face went blank for a moment, his confidence melting away. The street suddenly seemed quieter. Even the bystanders recording lowered their phones slightly, realizing something unexpected was unfolding. Marcus said softly, "I told you, I'm with the Bureau. I was just taking a short break before heading back to the field office." Daniels exhaled, his shoulders dropping a little. "All right, Agent Reed. Looks like we might have overstepped." Marcus gave a faint smile, though his eyes showed no amusement. "Happens more often than you'd think." And in that moment, just a few minutes into a routine stop, the story had already taken a turn no one on that street would forget. The air felt heavier now, as if time itself had slowed. Officer Daniels still held the license and registration in his hand, but he wasn't sure what to do next. The sunlight glinted off the edge of Marcus Reed's FBI badge, and for a brief second everything went silent. No car horns, no voices, just a strange, tense quiet. Marcus stood beside his SUV, calm but alert. Years of field experience had trained him to stay composed under pressure. Yet inside he couldn't help feeling the familiar sting of frustration. This wasn't the first time someone had looked at him and made the wrong assumption. Officer Carter cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Mind explaining what you're doing parked here, Agent?" "Reed, was it?" His voice sounded more cautious now, less confident. Marcus met his eyes evenly. "I just finished a meeting not far from here. I pulled over to answer an urgent message before heading back to my hotel." He spoke politely, with the calmness of someone who had nothing to prove, but Carter still looked uneasy. Daniels finally handed back the documents, his tone softening. "Didn't mean to cause trouble, sir. We just have to check everything out." Marcus gave a small nod. "I understand that. But I also understand that how things start can decide how they end. Communication goes a long way." It wasn't meant as a lecture, but the words hung heavy between them. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the man standing before him had probably handled situations far more dangerous than a traffic stop. Carter, however, couldn't shake his doubt. He had seen fake badges before, clever imitations that fooled even experienced officers. He stepped closer, eyeing Marcus carefully. "You'll have to understand, sir. We've had people try to pass off fake credentials before. You can't blame us for being careful." Marcus didn't flinch. "You're right," he said calmly. "But if you call your lieutenant, he'll confirm my credentials. He and I have spoken recently about an ongoing joint investigation." Daniels glanced at Carter. "Maybe we should do that," he suggested quietly. But Carter didn't move. There was something deeper in his hesitation. Pride, maybe, or the discomfort of being corrected. "We'll handle it," he said shortly, his tone sharp again. Marcus could feel the situation tilting again, that fine balance between authority and misunderstanding. He didn't want things to escalate, but he also couldn't ignore how quickly respect could turn into suspicion. "Look," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "I'm not trying to make this difficult. I just want to get back to my day." Before either officer could respond, a few more onlookers began gathering across the street. Phones were raised again, cameras blinking red. People whispered. No one knew the full story, but everyone could feel the tension in the air. Daniels noticed the growing crowd and sighed. "All right, let's not make this a scene," Carter muttered under his breath. "It already is one." Marcus caught that, but stayed silent. He had learned long ago that silence sometimes spoke louder than words. A moment later, Daniels tapped his radio. "Dispatch, can you run a check on a federal ID number?" He read out Marcus's credentials carefully. The dispatcher responded that verification might take a few minutes. Marcus stood there patiently, hands in plain sight. He wasn't angry, I'm just tired. Tired of moments like this that turned simple encounters into statements about trust and perception. The seconds dragged on. The city buzzed quietly around them, but the small corner where they stood felt frozen. Daniels checked his watch. 7 minutes, he murmured. That's how long this has been. Then in that 7th minute, everything shifted. A black sedan pulled up abruptly near the curb. The driver's door opened and out stepped Lieutenant Harper, a tall, gray-haired man with a commanding presence. He looked from Marcus to the two officers, instantly reading the situation. "Agent Reed?" he said, his tone sharp but familiar. "Didn't expect to see you here." Marcus offered a faint smile. "Afternoon, Lieutenant. Seems like there's been a mix-up." Harper's eyes hardened as he turned to Daniels and Carter. "You two tried to detain a federal agent?" His voice carried the weight of authority that filled the air instantly. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Carter stammered. "Sir, we were just verifying." "Verifying what?" Harper snapped. "He's been working with us on the federal narcotics case downtown. He's one of the good guys." The color drained from Carter's face. Daniels looked down, embarrassed. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, sensing that the drama was over, but the tension still lingered in the air. Marcus exhaled softly. "No harm done, Lieutenant." They were doing their job. Harper shook his head. "You're too patient, Marcus. Not everyone would have handled that as calmly as you did." Marcus smiled slightly, though his eyes were distant. "Patience is part of the job, sometimes the hardest part." As Harper led the officers aside for a quiet talk, Marcus leaned against his SUV, the afternoon sun warm on his back. He didn't feel angry anymore, just thoughtful. He'd seen enough to know that real change didn't come from anger, but from moments like this, when lessons were learned the hard way. And though the incident lasted only 7 minutes, it would stay in everyone's mind much longer, a reminder of how quickly misunderstanding can turn into danger, and how truth, when it finally arrives, can shock everyone watching. The tension in the air hadn't fully disappeared even after Lieutenant Harper's arrival. The small crowd had thinned out, but a few curious faces still lingered near the sidewalk, pretending to check their phones while quietly watching. The situation looked calm on the outside, but inside every person involved, emotions were still churning: pride, guilt, and disbelief. Marcus Reed stood beside his black SUV, his FBI badge still visible in his hand. He was the picture of calm professionalism, but behind that calm his thoughts were racing. He had seen this before, moments when misunderstanding wasn't just about rules but about perception. It wasn't the first time someone had doubted him before knowing who he really was. Lieutenant Harper turned to the two younger officers, his voice low but firm. "Do you understand how serious this could have become?" Daniels nodded quietly, his eyes full of regret. "Yes, sir. We didn't mean Harper cut him off. Meaning doesn't fix what almost happened. You saw a man, made assumptions, and acted before asking questions." Carter stayed silent, jaw tight. He wasn't angry anymore, just embarrassed. He looked at Marcus, trying to find words, but none came. Marcus, noticing his discomfort, decided to speak first. "Lieutenant, it's all right," he said calmly. "They were following procedure. The misunderstanding could have happened to anyone." Harper sighed. "You're too generous, Agent Reed." Marcus smiled faintly. "Experience teaches patience. And I've had a lot of experience." But even as he said it, something deep inside him stirred. That quiet frustration that no amount of patience could erase. He knew that if he had reacted differently, even slightly, things could have gone very wrong. One misunderstood gesture, one wrong word. That's all it would have taken. Harper stepped aside to take a call, leaving Marcus and the two officers standing awkwardly near the car. The sound of traffic filled the space between them. Finally, Daniel spoke up, voice low. "Agent Reed, I'm really sorry. We didn't mean any disrespect." Marcus looked at him, then at Carter. "Apologies accepted," he said. "But I hope you both remember something important. Not every situation is what it looks like. Sometimes the truth wears a face you don't expect." Carter nodded slowly, the weight of those words sinking in. As the men stood there, a soft breeze passed down the street, carrying the faint smell of exhaust and city dust. The world moved on around them. But this quiet moment of understanding was something all three would carry long after the day ended. A few minutes later, Harper finished his call and walked back. "Everything's cleared," he said, looking at Marcus. "The department's been notified about your presence in town. Won't happen again." Marcus nodded appreciatively. "Good to hear." He turned toward Daniels and Carter once more. "And for what it's worth, I don't hold this against you. Just make sure the next person you stop gets the same respect, even if they don't have a badge to prove who they are." There was silence after that. Not awkward, just thoughtful. Daniels finally said, "You've got my word, sir." Marcus gave a brief, polite smile, then walked back to his car. The reflection of the sun shimmered across the hood as he opened the door. But before getting in, he paused for a moment, his mind replaying the scene like a movie. 7 minutes. That's all it took for a calm afternoon to turn into a lesson. Not just for the officers, but for him too. Because even for an FBI agent, being on the other side of authority was a reminder of something powerful. Respect shouldn't depend on position, color, or title. It should come naturally, as the first reaction, not the last. As Marcus started his car, he glanced once more in the mirror. Daniels and Carter were still standing there, talking quietly to each other. Their expressions were different now, softer, thoughtful, almost humbled. Marcus exhaled slowly, letting the sound of the engine drown out his thoughts. Then as he drove away, Harper watched him go, shaking his head slightly. "That man's got more grace than most people I've met in uniform," he muttered. Daniels glanced at him. "Guess we got lucky today, sir." Harper gave a short nod. Luck had nothing to do with it. You got a lesson, and lessons like that don't come easy. As the black SUV disappeared into traffic, the city returned to its normal rhythm. But for the two young officers, that short encounter, those 7 minutes of confusion, tension, and truth would echo for a long time. Later that night, Daniels replayed the body cam footage privately, listening to every word, every pause. At one point he saw Marcus's calm face, heard him say softly, "Communication goes a long way." It wasn't just a statement, it was the heart of the whole story. And for the first time, Daniels truly understood what it meant to look beyond assumptions and see the human being standing in front of you. The next morning, the city woke up like nothing had happened. But for Agent Marcus Reed, the memory of yesterday's misunderstanding lingered in the back of his mind. He tried to shake it off as he poured himself a cup of coffee in his small hotel room, the sound of the city already buzzing outside. Yet something about that moment, those 7 tense minutes, they wouldn't leave him. He had faced far more dangerous situations in his FBI career, undercover operations, armed suspects, high-stakes investigation, but this was different. This was personal. It reminded him that even a badge didn't always protect you from bias or assumption. Later that day, Marcus was scheduled to meet Lieutenant Harper again at the downtown precinct. The department wanted to review the incident officially and include the footage in their internal training program. Harper had personally asked Marcus to join, partly as a formality, partly as a gesture of respect. When Marcus entered the precinct, the air shifted. Officers who had heard about the incident turned to look. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked away, unsure how to act. Harper greeted him at the door with a firm handshake. "Glad you came, Agent Reed. Let's get this sorted." They headed into a small meeting room. Daniels and Carter were already there, seated side by side. Both looked uneasy but stood up when Marcus walked in. "Morning," Marcus said, his tone even. "Morning, sir," Daniels replied quietly. Carter only nodded, his eyes fixed on the table. Harper motioned for everyone to sit. "We're not here to point fingers," he began. "We're here to learn." The room was quiet except for the hum of the overhead fan. On the large screen at the front, the body cam footage from yesterday began to play. The recording started with routine chatter, but soon, the tension filled the room as they watched themselves escalate a simple stop into a near arrest. Marcus sat still, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Daniel shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. Carter leaned back, avoiding eye contact. When the moment came, the part where Marcus reached for his registration and Carter's hand moved to his holster, the room went completely silent. Even Harper's face tightened. "Pause it there," Marcus said softly. The video froze on a still frame. Marcus's hand halfway toward the glove compartment, Carter's eyes sharp with suspicion. "Right there," Marcus continued. "That's when it changed. Not because anyone did anything wrong on purpose, but because of a story you told yourselves in that moment." Daniels frowned. "A story?" "Yes," Marcus said. "In your mind, you saw a threat. In mine, I saw officers doing their job. The problem is, both of us were acting on instinct, but only one of us had to prove we weren't dangerous." The words hit like quiet thunder. No one spoke. Harper exhaled, rubbing his chin. "He's right. This is why training matters. Not just the rules, but the mindset. Carter finally looked up. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "I didn't see you, sir. I just saw a situation. I reacted before thinking." Marcus gave a small, understanding nod. And that's exactly what escalation is. It starts with reaction instead of reason. The room fell into silence again. Outside, the faint sound of sirens echoed through the streets, a reminder of the constant tension between law and life. After a moment, Marcus stood up and walked toward the screen. "You see, gentlemen, misunderstanding is dangerous not because it's intentional, but because it's invisible. You don't realize it's happening until it's too late." Daniels swallowed hard. "You think we could have done anything differently?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Yes, ask questions before assuming answers." Harper leaned back, impressed. "That's going into the next training video word for word." Marcus chuckled softly, though there was still a shadow in his eyes. If it helps someone else avoid this, then it's worth it. When the meeting ended, Marcus stepped outside the building into the afternoon light. The air felt cooler now, fresher, like the city itself had exhaled. Harper walked beside him for a moment. "You handled that well," he said. "Most people in your place would have been angry." Marcus shook his head. "Anger doesn't fix what's broken. Understanding does." As they parted ways, Harper called after him. "Agent Reed, I hope those two learned something today." Marcus turned back, smiling faintly. "They did, and so did I." Later that evening, Carter sat in his car alone, watching the sunset over the city skyline. He replayed Marcus's words again and again in his head. Ask questions before assuming answers. It echoed like a quiet truth he hadn't wanted to hear, but needed to. From that day forward, something in him changed. He became slower to judge, quicker to listen. And though he never said it out loud, he knew those 7 minutes with Marcus Reed had left a mark far deeper than any police manual ever could. Days passed after the meeting at the precinct, but the memory of that tense afternoon still clung to everyone involved. For Agent Marcus Reed, it became one more story in a long line of lessons learned the hard way. But for Officer Carter and Officer Daniels, it marked the start of a quiet change, one that neither of them expected. It was a calm Friday morning when the turning point arrived. The air smelled of rain and the city felt slower than usual, heavy with gray clouds. Marcus was back in the field, dressed in his sharp black suit and tie, working on a joint federal operation with the same precinct that had once stopped him. Fate, it seemed, wasn't finished with them yet. Inside the briefing room, Lieutenant Harper stood in front of a digital map spread across the screen. "All right, team," he began. "We've got a suspect moving through downtown. Armed, unpredictable, and linked to the narcotics case Agent Reed's been leading. We've got to move fast but smart." As Harper spoke, Marcus noticed two familiar faces walk in late. Daniels and Carter. Their eyes met for a brief moment. It wasn't awkward anymore, just silent respect. The past was behind them, but the memory of that 7-minute misunderstanding still hovered like a ghost between them. The operation began an hour later. Rain started to fall, turning the streets slick and reflective like mirrors. The suspect, a man named Troy Bennett, known for his violent record, had been spotted entering an abandoned warehouse on the east side. Marcus and Carter ended up in the same tactical unit, moving through the shadows with radios whispering in their ears. Daniel stayed outside monitoring the perimeter. "Reed, you take the left flank." Harper's voice came through the earpiece. "Carter, stay on his 6. No mistakes today." They nodded silently and moved forward, boots splashing through shallow puddles. The tension in the air was sharp, the kind that tightens your chest before something big happens. Inside the warehouse, the sound of dripping water echoed off rusted metal beams. The smell of oil and dust filled the air. Marcus raised his flashlight, scanning the dark corners. Suddenly, a faint movement, a shadow darting behind a stack of crates. "Freeze!" Marcus shouted. But before anyone could react, a gunshot rang out. Sharp, echoing, deafening. Carter flinched, diving for cover. Marcus crouched low, returning fire, his movements precise and calm. Years of training kicked in. When the noise settled for a moment, Marcus signaled with his hand. "Cover me." Carter nodded, his hands shaking slightly. He wasn't used to working beside someone this composed under fire, especially someone he'd once doubted so deeply. Marcus moved forward carefully, every step deliberate. Another flash. The suspect lunged out, gun raised. But before he could fire again, Marcus disarmed him with a swift move, sending the weapon skidding across the floor. Carter rushed in, cuffs ready. "Hands behind your back!" The suspect struggled but gave up, panting. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder outside. Within minutes, the building filled with officers. The arrest was done. No one hurt. As the suspect was led away, Harper entered, rain dripping from his jacket. "Nice work, gentlemen. Clean and quick." Carter turned to Marcus, his voice quiet but full of sincerity. "You saved my life back there." Marcus shook his head. "We saved each other. That's how it's supposed to work." For the first time since their first encounter, Carter smiled. A real smile, the kind that came from humility and gratitude. "Guess we've come a long way from that parking stop." Marcus chuckled softly. 7 minutes can change a lot more than you think. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds were parting, letting a soft orange glow slip through. The kind of light that makes everything look cleaner, renewed. Daniels approached, patting Carter's shoulder. "Heard you two had some action in there. Everyone good?" "Better than good," Carter said, glancing at Marcus. "Learned something about trust today." Marcus met his eyes and nodded once. "That's the real work. Everything else is just part of the job." As the team packed up, Harper watched Marcus from a distance. There was something different about the man. Not just his calmness, but the quiet strength he carried. The kind that came from being tested and still choosing grace over anger. Later, when the reports were filed and the city went back to its usual rhythm, Harper sent an email to the department with one simple line attached to the footage from the arrest. This is what professionalism looks like. Respect, courage, and patience in action. That day, the misunderstanding that once divided them had become the very thing that united them. Marcus Reed drove away that evening with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The city lights reflected on his windshield, glowing like tiny reminders of how fragile and how powerful understanding could be. Sometimes, he thought, life gives you moments that test you not to break you, but to show others how to rise. And for Marcus, that day was proof. Even the smallest encounters can turn into the biggest turning points. The city had gone quiet again. The rain-soaked streets gleamed under the streetlights like mirrors reflecting the past day's chaos. Agent Marcus Reed sat alone in his SUV, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. The wipers had stopped, but a few last drops of rain slid down the windshield, blurring the glow of the world outside. He took a long breath and leaned back. The adrenaline from the warehouse raid was fading, leaving behind that familiar emptiness, the silence that comes after intensity. Yet this time the silence didn't feel cold. It felt peaceful. For the first time since the misunderstanding with the officers, Marcus felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pride or relief, it was realization. He thought back to Carter's words at the scene. "You saved my life." Simple words, but heavy with meaning. Only a week ago, that same man had doubted him, judged him without knowing him. And now, standing side by side, they had trusted each other with their lives. It was strange how quickly the world could turn. How 7 minutes of misunderstanding could lead to 7 seconds of trust that changed everything. As Marcus sat there watching the rain light shimmer across the dashboard, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Lieutenant Harper. "Good work today. You changed more than a case, you changed minds." Marcus smiled faintly. He didn't reply, not because he didn't appreciate it, but because he didn't know how to put the feeling into words. He just sat there letting the weight of those words sink in. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Carter couldn't sleep. He sat at his small kitchen table, staring at his body cam footage on his laptop. Not from the arrest, but from that first day, the stop that started it all. He watched himself standing stiff and defensive, his hand near his holster, his tone sharp. He saw Marcus, calm, composed, patient, never raising his voice, never reacting with anger. Carter paused the video and sighed. "Man," he whispered to himself, "I almost ruined something good." He rubbed his hands over his face, realizing how much his perspective had changed in just a few days. It wasn't just about race or authority or fear. It was about humanity. About how quick judgment can build walls and how a little understanding can break them down in seconds. He opened a blank notepad and typed a few words. Respect first. Judgment later. He didn't know why he wrote it, but it felt right, like a quiet promise to himself. The next morning, Carter walked into the precinct early. He found Daniels by the coffee machine, half awake. "You ever think about that day?" he asked suddenly. Daniels gave a half smile. "Every day since, yeah," Carter said, nodding. "Me too, but you know what? I'm kind of glad it happened." Daniels looked at him, confused. "Glad? Why?" Carter shrugged. "Because if it hadn't, I wouldn't have learned what real respect looks like. I thought the badge made me the authority. Turns out authority doesn't come from the badge, and it comes from how you treat people." Daniels didn't say anything, but the truth in Carter's words hit deep. A few hours later, Marcus arrived at the station to sign off on his field report. When he stepped through the doors, the room fell quiet for a second, not out of awkwardness this time, but out of respect. Officers nodded as he passed by. The look in their eyes had changed. Carter approached him. "Agent Reed," he said with a small smile. "You free for coffee?" "I owe you one," Marcus grinned. "You owe me more than one." They laughed, not as agent and officer, but as two men who had seen both sides of misunderstanding and decided to stand on the same one. As they walked down the street toward a small cafe, Carter said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot since that day. You didn't just handle that situation, you handled us. You taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn." Marcus looked at him with a knowing smile. "What's that?" "That patience isn't weakness," Carter said. "It's power." Marcus nodded slowly. "Now that's a lesson worth remembering." The two men sat by the window, sipping their coffee as the city buzzed outside. The world hadn't changed overnight. There would still be misunderstanding, still be fear, still be prejudice. But in that small cafe, something had changed. Two people who had once stood on opposite sides of judgment now sat together, united by experience, humility, and truth. As Marcus looked out at the busy street, a small smile crossed his face. Maybe this was what real change looked like. Not loud or dramatic, but quiet, steady, and deeply human. And though he would never call it fate, Marcus couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, that 7-minute misunderstanding had happened for a reason. Because sometimes, the hardest lessons in life are the ones that open the right eyes. A week passed since the warehouse arrest, a week that felt longer than most months. The city had moved on, the news cycle had turned, but for Agent Marcus Reed, the echoes of those moments still followed him. Not as noise, but as quiet reminders of how quickly the line between misunderstanding and connection can disappear. The precinct was different now. Conversations were softer, greetings warmer. Officers who once glanced past him now nodded respectfully when he entered. The change wasn't loud or forced, it was subtle but real. Marcus wasn't looking for recognition, though. He had seen enough to know that real growth doesn't need applause. It happens quietly in the way people think, act, and remember. Lieutenant Harper called him into his office one morning. "Agent Reed," he said, motioning to a chair. "You might want to see this." He slid a thin file across the desk. Inside was a printed email chain from the police department training division. The incident between Marcus and the officers had been officially approved as part of a national training module on communication. De-escalation and bias awareness, they're calling it the 7-minute lesson, Harper said with a small smile. "Your story's going to be shown in academies across the country." Marcus stared at the file for a moment. He didn't know whether to laugh or feel emotional. "All that from one misunderstanding?" he asked quietly. Harper leaned back in his chair. "Sometimes one small fire lights the biggest change. You didn't just handle it, you turned it into something meaningful." Marcus nodded slowly. "If it helps even one officer think differently next time, it's worth it." Harper smiled. "You know, you've done more for this department than some do in an entire career." Later that afternoon, Marcus stepped outside the precinct. The sky was bright and open, washed clean after a night of rain. Across the street, he spotted Officer Carter helping a young man whose car had broken down. Carter wasn't shouting orders or showing authority. He was kneeling beside the open hood, explaining calmly, even laughing. It was a small thing, but to Marcus, it spoke volumes. When Carter noticed him watching, he waved and crossed the street. "Agent Reed, you back in town?" "Just tying up some paperwork," Marcus replied. "You seem busy making friends," Carter laughed. "Trying to be the change, right? You started something, you know that?" Marcus smiled. We all did. For a moment they stood there in silence, watching the city pulse around them. Sirens in the distance, horns echoing faintly, people rushing by. Life didn't stop for lessons, but it always left space for growth. Carter broke the silence. You ever think about how different things could have gone that day? All the time, Marcus admitted. But maybe it had to happen. Sometimes we need friction to see the spark. Carter nodded thoughtfully. I guess you're right. That day could have been another bad headline. Instead, it became something else. Marcus looked toward the busy street, eyes thoughtful. Yeah, a reminder that everyone wears a story and not just a uniform. Carter smiled at that. You should put that on a poster. Maybe you should, Marcus replied with a grin. That evening, Marcus packed his bag at the hotel, preparing to return to Washington. The city lights shimmered outside his window, bright dots stretching endlessly toward the horizon. He thought about everything that had happened. The stop, the confusion, the lesson, the teamwork, the realization. It all fit together now. Like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was building. He picked up his phone and opened a message from Harper that had just arrived. It was short but powerful. Because of you, our next generation of officers will think before reacting. Marcus read it twice, then placed the phone down. He looked out at the skyline one last time before turning off the lights. In that quiet darkness, he smiled to himself. The incident that once embarrassed two officers and frustrated a federal agent had now become something far bigger, a story of transformation. A moment that taught empathy, patience, and understanding in a world that often forgot all three. And though Marcus would never seek the spotlight, deep down, he knew this was the kind of impact that mattered most. The kind that changed hearts. Not headlines,